company's BP will go to court in Galveston, Texas, to face a young woman who says the company killed her parents. The woman's parents were among 15 oil workers who died in an explosion last year at BP's refinery in Texas City. At least 170 others were also injured in the blast. It was the worst workplace accident in this country since 1989. 60 Minutes spent the last 3 months investigating that explosion at Texas City. Ed Bradley found evidence that BP ignored warning after warning that something terrible could happen there.
The BP refinery in Texas City extends over nearly 2 square miles on the outskirts of Galveston. It's the third largest refinery in the U.S. On March 23, 2005, BP employees and contract workers began an especially dangerous procedure, restarting a unit that had been shut down for repairs. They began to fill a tower with gasoline. The tower overflowed and the excess gas flowed into this backup unit, which then also overflowed and sent a geyser of gasoline into the air. Pat Nickerson, a 28-year veteran of the Texas City refinery, was on the site that day, driving his truck to an office trailer.
I looked on the road and it looked like fumes, like on a real hot day you see this heat waves coming up, and then I saw an ignition and a blast. Then my windshield shattered, the roof of the vehicle I was driving caved in on me.
The plume of gas had formed a massive vapor cloud on the ground, and an idling truck likely had ignited the fumes. The blast pulverized several office trailers full of workers parked nearby. Pat Nickerson began digging through the wreckage looking for survivors.
Out of the corner of my eye, there was somebody on the ground, a guy named Brian Rodriguez, and he just kind of just staring at me. He couldn't move because his face was so, deformed and everything from the blast, and some, bones and stuff that were, protruding from his chin.
What happened to him eventually?
He died in the ambulance.
21-year-old Eva Rowe was driving to Texas City to visit her parents, who worked in one of those trailers.
I was at a gas station about 45 minutes away. Some men inside said that the BP refinery had exploded. I called my mom, and my mom didn't answer, and it's not like my mom. She always answered.
It was hours before Eva Rowe learned what had happened.
A worker who actually worked at the plant collapsed to the floor crying, telling me that he was so sorry that he couldn't find my parents, but he'd been looking for them since the explosion happened. And so then I knew.
Eva Rowe's parents were among the 15 who died that day in Texas City.
My parents were my best friends. They're all I had. My life ended that day. BP ruined my life and ended my life that day. I had to start all over.
In the aftermath of the explosion, BP blamed the disaster mostly on operator error and fired 6 employees.
In a fire.
We went to Texas City to investigate further. BP officials gave us a tour of the refinery, but they declined our request for an interview. They referred us to their own report on the explosion, which concluded there was no evidence of anyone consciously or intentionally taking actions or decisions that put others at risk. But when we spoke to the chief government official who's been investigating the explosion, she told us that's not true.
The problems that existed at BP Texas City were neither momentary nor superficial. They ran deep through that operation of a risk denial and a risk blindness that was not being addressed anywhere in the organization.
Carolyn Merritt, appointed by President Bush to chair the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, has led an 18-month investigation into what happened at Texas City.
These things do not have to happen. They are preventable, they're predictable, and people do not have to die because they're earning a living.
You think this accident could have been easily prevented?
Absolutely.
Merritt's investigators found problems at Texas City just about everywhere they looked. Antiquated equipment, corroded pipes about to burst, and safety alarms that didn't work.
There were 3 key pieces of instrumentation that were actually supposed to be repaired that were not repaired. And the management knew this.
And nothing was done about it?
They authorized the startup knowing that these 3 pieces of equipment were not properly working.
So that you had critical alarms critical safety mechanisms which were known by management to be faulty, and they weren't fixed.
That's correct.
But it wasn't just equipment that failed at Texas City. BP broke its own rules by placing trailers full of workers in this open area right next to the unit being filled with gasoline. BP also failed to tell the workers in those trailers about the dangerous operation about to take place close by.
There was not a thing said about that unit starting up.
So if I understand you correctly, that morning there was a safety meeting. The plant was about to start up the unit, which is an especially dangerous procedure, but none of the workers were told about this at the safety meeting?
Nothing was said.
How many of you were at the meeting?
300-400 people.
Placing a trailer during the startup operation that's going to be full of people without any warning is the telltale sign that you've lost that understanding and realization of the very risk of what you do.
BP is the world's third largest oil company, with headquarters in London and assets that stretch from Alaska to the Caspian Sea. The company got as big as it is today by acquiring old companies at cheap prices and then relentlessly cutting costs. That, according to Matt Simmons, chairman of a major energy investment banking firm.
Their reputation as what a fabulous company they were got created because they made more money than anyone else did on old assets.
And did they do that by cutting costs?
Well, they had to. But I don't think it was obvious but to anybody until now. You look back and benefit of hindsight, and they obviously cut way too many costs.
Couldn't you argue that BP had to cut costs in order to stay profitable,
absolutely.
in order to stay in the
Absolutely.
business?
But then the question becomes, at what point do you basically go beyond normal cost cutting and you're into reckless behavior?
But BP's senior executive in charge of refineries, John Manzoni, denies that. He told lawyers in this deposition that budget cuts never compromised the safety of BP's employees.
I don't believe it's the case, ever, that we shortchange budgets on safety issues.
If in this trial someone says that BP puts profits over the safety of its people, what would be your response to that?
My response would be that's not how we run the company.
But when BP acquired the Texas City refinery from Amoco 8 years ago, the plant was already in a state of disrepair. Instead of spending money to update the plant, BP executives in London told the refinery managers to cut their budgets.
25% of their fixed costs were cut. And when you cut that much out of a budget in a facility, you lose people, you lose equipment, you lose maintenance, you lose trainers. Our investigation has shown that this was a drastic mistake.
So as the Texas refinery got older and needed more maintenance, more attention to safety, BP cut the budget in those areas?
Yes.
Is there a direct relationship between the budget cut and the disaster at Texas City?
We believe there is.
One of the best examples, she says, is on the very unit that caused the explosion. In the 10 years leading up to the disaster, there had been 8 major gasoline vapor releases on that unit, any one of which could have been catastrophic. Most refineries install safety devices called flares to burn off excess gasoline to avoid disaster. BP chose not to.
Doing good. What's up?
Brent Kuhn is a Texas lawyer representing several victims suing BP. He'll argue in court that by failing to upgrade antiquated equipment with flares, the company knowingly put lives at risk.
They knew that if they didn't fix these things, they were increasing the risk, unnecessarily increasing the risk of something major happening.
So why were they still using them at Texas City?
Because it cost several $1 million to get rid of them.
But I mean, this was a plant that made how much in profit?
They made about $1 billion a year at that one plant.
So there's money there to replace them.
Sure. Well, Ed, deals, you want to make $1 billion or you want to make $998 million? They chose to make $1 billion.
There is evidence that Texas City's own plant manager, Don Paris, was dismayed by unsafe conditions at the refinery and even tried to get the attention of his bosses in London. He briefed them on a report revealing that most workers at the refinery felt the plant was unsafe. One worker wrote, "The equipment is in dangerous condition and this is not taken seriously." Another wrote, "This place is set up for a catastrophic failure."
But what do you do when you realize that everybody at the plant says this place is about to blow up?
And what did they do?
Yeah, they didn't do much. 2 months later, the plant blew up.
BP's top refinery executive, John Manzoni, said under oath that he didn't know of serious safety concerns at the refinery until the day of the explosion.
23rd of March 2005.
Before that, you had no idea that there was a risk of catastrophic injury?
No, I think had I been aware that we could have had a catastrophic failure, we would have taken action earlier.
Are you telling me that there were not members of management who were quite aware that there was a great risk of harm to people at Texas City before this explosion occurred?
I believe that there were. I believe nobody knew the level of risk at Texas City, because if they had known, I have absolutely no doubt we would have taken different and substantively different actions.
And yet, 2.5 years before the explosion, the company's own safety experts sent a report to London that actually predicted what would happen. It warned that the history of petroleum leaks at Texas City created the potential for a major site incident. Before the explosion, BP London did increase spending at Texas City. But plant manager Don Paris has now acknowledged in a deposition that it was too little, too late. Just this week, the company sent us a letter which said, BP accepts responsibility for the explosion and fire at the Texas City refinery. We are deeply sorry for what occurred and for the suffering caused by our mistakes. The company has set aside $1.6 billion to settle lawsuits with victims and survivors. If every plaintiff settles and the case never goes to trial, many of those damaging internal BP documents will remain under court seal. Eva Rowe, who lost both of her parents, says she won't go along with that. Hers is the lawsuit against BP that goes to court next week.
To BP, my parents were just another number. To them, they're replaceable. To me, they weren't just a number. They're somebody.
A lot of people who suffered terrible losses that day have already settled with BP. Has BP offered to settle with you?
Yes.
And they've offered you, I assume, a substantial amount of money?
I want everybody to know what they did, you know. If we settle, then everything we know has to remain confidential. I don't want that to happen.
So you're willing to go to trial?
No, I'm ready. I'm ready to go to trial.
Today,